The transport ship docked at the Galactic Defense Academy station with a soft hiss, and Danny Brooks grabbed his single bag and stepped into his new life with the same calm confidence he had carried since leaving Earth. He was 22 years old, and average height for a human, which meant he was shorter than most species in the galaxy, and he had brown hair and dark eyes that observed everything with quiet curiosity. The station was enormous and filled with species he had only seen in training, videos back home, and there were tall insectoid beings with 4 arms and squat rock-like creatures that moved slowly and careful flyers with translucent wings that caught the light. Danny followed the signs to the cadet registration area and noticed how other beings stared at him because humans were still new to the galactic community, and most species had not met one in person yet. The registration officer was a pale blue creature with too many eyes, and it processed his papers quickly while explaining the basic rules of the academy in a voice that sounded like water running over stones. Humans are fragile, the officer said without any meanness, just stating a fact that everyone seemed to believe, and you should consider taking the basics training courses instead of the advanced combat program. Danny smiled politely and said he would stick with his chosen program because he had not traveled across the galaxy to take easy classes, and the officer made a sound that might have been a sigh and approved his registration. His quarters were small but clean, with a bed that adjusted to different body types and a window that looked out at the stars. And Danny spent his first night reading about the different instructors and courses. The advanced combat instructor was named Lyra Silvermoon, and she came from a species called the Draenei, who evolved on a high-gravity world and were known throughout the galaxy as some of the finest warriors and peacekeepers. Her picture showed a tall woman with silver skin that seemed to glow and long white hair that fell past her shoulders and eyes that were completely silver without any visible pupil, and behind her was a long, thick tail that the information said was prehensile and strong, enough to lift heavy objects. Danny read that Draenei were naturally stronger and faster than most species, and their tails were sensitive enough to feel vibrations in the air and could be used as an extra limb in combat situations. He also read that Draenei rarely formed bonds with other species because they considered most beings too fragile, and their culture valued strength and honor above almost everything else. The next morning, Danny woke early and put on his training uniform, which was a simple black suit that regulated temperature, and he made his way to the combat training hall following the map on his datapad. The hall was massive with sections that could simulate different environments and gravity levels, and there were already several cadets gathered near the entrance talking in various languages. Danny recognized some of the species from his research, and there was a Krell who stood nearly 8 feet tall with gray-scaled skin, and a Vixen with red fur and sharp teeth, and 2 Zentauri who looked almost human except for their golden eyes. They all turned to look at him when he approached, and one of the Zentauri made a clicking sound that his translator converted to laughter. A human in advanced combat. The Zentauri said to his companion, "And how long do you think he will last?" Danny ignored the comment and found a spot to wait, because he had learned long ago that the best response to doubt was simply proving people wrong through action. The door to the instructor office opened and everyone fell silent. Lyra Silvermoon walked out, and she was even more impressive in person than her picture suggested, because she moved with a grace that seemed impossible for someone so tall and strong, and her tail swayed behind her in patterns that Danny found himself watching. She looked over the group of 12 cadets with those strange silver eyes, and Danny felt like she was measuring each of them and finding most of them wanting. "Welcome to advanced combat training," she said in a voice that was firm but not unkind. "And I am Instructor Silvermoon, and over the next 6 months I will teach you how to survive in situations that would kill most beings." She began walking between them, and her tail moved constantly, like it had a mind of its own. "This course has the highest dropout rate in the academy," she continued, "and last cycle only 3 students finished, and if you are not prepared to push beyond your limits, then you should leave now." Nobody moved. Lyra stopped in front of Danny and looked down at him because she was at least a foot taller and her tail curved up behind her like a question mark. "You are human," she stated. "Yes, instructor," Danny replied, meeting her silver eyes without flinching. "Humans are new to the academy," she said, "and we do not have much data on your physical capabilities, and most species consider your kind to be fragile." Danny had heard this many times already, But coming from her, it felt different, because she was not being dismissive. "Just careful. I am stronger than I look, instructor," he said simply. Lyra studied him for a long moment, and her tail moved in a way that he could not interpret, and then she nodded once and moved on to inspect the other cadets. The first lesson began, with basic exercises to assess their current fitness levels, and Lyra had them run through an obstacle course under standard gravity while she watched and took notes. Danny completed the course in a respectable time, and he noticed that he was faster than about half the class, but nowhere near as fast as Lyra herself, who demonstrated the course moving like liquid silver. After the assessment, Lyra called them together and explained that each student would train at a gravity level appropriate to their species, and for most that meant standard or slightly above. She looked directly at Danny when she said that humans would probably train at 0.8 standard gravity to account for their fragile bone structure. Danny raised his hand, yes. Cadet Brooks, Lyra said, and her tail had stopped moving, which he was learning meant she was very focused. "With respect, instructor, I would like to request a higher gravity setting," he said calmly. The other cadets made various sounds of surprise, and the Zentari who had mocked him earlier actually laughed out loud. Lyra tilted her head slightly. "And what level did you have in mind?" Danny took a breath and said, "Triple standard if possible." The training hall went completely silent, and even the Krell, who never showed emotion, looked shocked. Lyra stared at him, and her tail began moving in quick, sharp patterns, and she crossed her arms over her chest. "That is the gravity level of my home world," she said slowly, "and it is designed to challenge my species, not train humans." "Understand, instructor," Danny replied, "but Earth gravity is actually 1.2 standard, and I have been training under enhanced gravity since I was 16. Lyra looked at him like she was seeing him for the first time, and something changed in her expression, though Danny could not name what it was. "Very well," she said finally, "but you will wear full safety gear, and if I see any signs of injury, you will be reduced to a lower setting." Immediately, Danny felt his heart beat faster, with excitement, and he said, "Thank you." Instructor Lyra waved her hand, dismissing the class, and as Danny walked past her, he felt her tail brush against his arm so lightly he almost thought he imagined it. And when he glanced back, she was watching him with an expression that might have been curiosity. Danny arrived at the training hall early the next morning because he wanted to be ready when Lyra activated the triple gravity field, and he spent 20 minutes stretching and preparing his body for what was coming. The other cadets filtered in slowly, and they kept glancing at him with expressions that ranged from concern to amusement because word had spread that the human was going to attempt training under Drainy. Gravity Lyra entered, exactly on time, and she was wearing her training uniform, which was sleeveless and showed the lean muscle of her arms, and her tail moved in calm, steady patterns behind her. She walked directly to Danny and held out a harness that was covered in small sensors. "This will monitor your vital signs," she explained, "and if your heart rate or blood pressure reaches dangerous levels, the system will alert me immediately, and the gravity field will reduce automatically." Danny took the harness and put it on over his uniform, and Lyra helped him adjust the straps, and her fingers were surprisingly gentle despite her obvious strength. She stepped back and looked him over and said, "The field will activate in 30 seconds, and if you need to stop at any time, just raise your hand and I will shut it down." Danny nodded and moved to the section of the training hall that was marked for high-gravity exercises, and the other cadets had moved to the observation area to watch Lyra touch the control panel and said, "Beginning triple standard gravity in 3, 2, 1. The field activated, and Danny felt the weight hit him like a physical blow. His knees buckled slightly, and every part of his body suddenly felt 3 times heavier, and his lungs had to work harder just to draw breath. And for a moment he wondered if he had made a terrible mistake. But then his training kicked in, and he remembered the enhanced gravity chambers back on Earth where he had spent hundreds of hours preparing for exactly this, and he forced himself to straighten up and roll his shoulders. He looked at Lyra and saw surprise flash across her face because she had clearly expected him to collapse. "Good," she said, and her tail had started moving faster, which he was learning meant she was interested, and now walked to the end of the mat and back. Danny took a step, and it felt like he was moving through thick mud in every muscle. He and his body screamed at him to stop, but he kept going because he had not come this far to give up on day 2. Each step was a challenge, and sweat was already dripping down his face. But he made it to the end of the mat and turned around and walked. Back his legs were shaking by the time he reached the starting point, but he was still standing. Lyra nodded slowly and said, "Rest for 2 minutes and then we will try some basic exercises." Danny sat down carefully and the weight made even that simple action difficult, and he focused on breathing and keeping his heart rate steady. The 2 minutes passed too quickly and Lyra called him back to standing position. 10 squats, she instructed, and take your time. Danny began the squats and they were brutal, because every movement down felt like he might not be able to get back up, and his thighs burned with effort. But he completed all 10 push-ups. She said next, and as many as you can manage. Danny got down on the mat and the weight pressing on his back made it feel impossible, but he managed 5 push-ups before his arms gave out and he collapsed onto the mat, breathing hard. The other cadets were silent in the observation area, and Danny could feel their eyes on him. Lyra walked over and her tail reached down and wrapped gently around his arm and lifted him back to his feet with ease. "Enough for today," she said, and her voice was softer than before. "And you did better than I expected." Human Danny wanted to protest that he could do more, but his body was telling him otherwise, and he nodded and said thank you. Instructor Lyra deactivated the gravity field, and the sudden relief made Danny feel like he might float away, and his legs nearly gave out again, but her tail was still wrapped around his arm, keeping him steady. "Go to medical and have them check you over," she said, "and drink plenty of fluids and eat protein." Danny started to walk away but turned back and asked, "When can I train under triple gravity again?" Lyra stared at him and her tail unwrapped from his arm slowly, and she said, "Tomorrow if medical clears you," and there was something in her eyes that looked almost like respect. Over the next week, Danny trained under triple gravity every day, and each session Lyra pushed him a little harder, and his body slowly began to adapt to the crushing weight. He noticed that Lyra spent more time watching him than the other cadets, and whenever he struggled, her tail would reach out to steady him or help him up. The other students had stopped mocking him because they could see how hard he was working, and the Krell actually approached him after one session and said in his deep rumbling voice that Danny had earned his respect. On the 8th day, Lyra had Danny run through a basic obstacle course under triple gravity, and it included climbing walls and balance beams and swinging ropes. Danny moved slowly and carefully, and his muscles burned with every movement, but he made it through the entire course without falling when he finished. Lyra was standing at the end with her arms crossed and her tail moving in quick, excited patterns. "You are adapting faster than any species I have seen," she said, "and how is this possible?" Danny wiped sweat from his face and said, "Humans evolved on a dangerous world, and we learned to adapt or die, and our bodies are good at getting stronger when we need to." Lyra tilted her head and said, "I have heard stories about human worlds, but I thought they were exaggerations." "They are not," Danny replied, "and Earth has extreme weather and dangerous animals and natural disasters, and humans survived by being stubborn and adaptable." Something shifted in Lyra's expression, and she said, "Tell me more about your world." They sat down on a bench, and Danny told her about Earth while the other cadets continued their training. He described oceans that could swallow ships and storms that could level cities and predators that hunted in packs, and Lyra listened with her full attention, and her tail had wrapped loosely around the bench between them. "Your species should not exist," she said when he finished, "and by all logic, a world that dangerous should have killed you before you developed intelligence. But it did not," Danny said with a smile, "and instead, it made us strong." Lyra looked at him for a long moment, and then her tail moved and wrapped gently around his wrist. "You are not what I expected." "Human Danny Brooks," she said quietly. Danny looked at where her tail touched him and felt his heart beat faster, and he said, "What did you expect, instructor?" She smiled, and it was the first real smile he had seen from her, and she said, "Someone who would quit after the first day." He laughed and said, "I do not quit easily. I am beginning to understand that," she said, and her tail tightened just slightly around his wrist. They sat there for a moment, and Danny realized that something had changed between them, and it was not just instructor and student anymore. Lyra seemed to realize it too, because she unwrapped her tail and stood up quickly and said, "Back to training, Cadet." But as Danny stood and moved back to the training area, he saw her watching him, and her tail was moving in patterns he was starting to understand meant happiness. 3 weeks into training, Danny had built enough strength under triple gravity that Lyra began teaching him actual combat techniques, and this was when he discovered just how skilled she truly was. They stood in the center of the training mat, and Lyra explained that Draenei fighting style focused on using their superior strength and their tails as a third weapon watch, she said, and she moved through a series of strikes and blocks so fast that Danny could barely follow, and her tail whipped around to strike targets that her hands and feet could not reach. Now you try, she instructed. Danny attempted to copy her movements, but under triple gravity, his body moved like it was stuck in honey, and he lost his balance on the third move and started to fall. Lyra tail shot out and wrapped around his waist and caught him before he hit the mat, and she pulled him back upright with ease. Your balance is off, she said, and you are thinking too much about the gravity, and let your body move naturally. Danny tried again, and this time he focused on the movement instead of the weight, and he made it through the entire sequence even though it was slow and clumsy. Better, Lyra said, and her tail unwrapped from his waist but stayed close like it was ready to catch him again. They practiced for an hour, and by the end Danny was exhausted, but he had started to understand the rhythm of the fighting style, and Lyra seemed pleased with his progress. The next day, Lyra announced that they would begin sparring, and Danny would be paired with her because none of the other students could safely fight under triple gravity. This is not a real fight, she explained as they faced each other on the mat, and I will hold back significantly, but I want to see how you respond to pressure. Danny nodded and took a defensive stance. Lyra moved first, and even holding back she was incredibly fast, and her fist came at his face in a strike that he barely managed to block. Her tail swept at his legs and he jumped, but the triple gravity made him slow, and the tail caught his ankle and pulled him off balance. He hit the mat hard and the wind was knocked out of him. Lyra was beside him instantly, and her tail wrapped around his shoulders and helped him sit up. Are you hurt? She asked, and there was genuine concern in her voice. Just my pride. Danny gasped, and can we go again? She studied him for a moment and then nodded and said, your determination is admirable. They sparred 3 more times, and each time Danny lasted a little longer before Lyra put him on the mat, and each time her tail was there to help him up on the 4th round. Danny managed to land a single strike on her shoulder, and it was not hard enough to hurt her, but it was real contact. Lyra stepped back and her eyes widened, and her tail froze mid-motion. You hit me, she said, and she sounded genuinely surprised. Danny grinned despite his exhaustion and said, you told me to try. Lyra smiled, and it transformed her entire face, and she said, so I did, and well done, Cadet Brooks. That evening, Danny was in the recovery room using the medical scanner to check for injuries when Lyra walked in. Her tail moved nervously behind her, and she said, I wanted to make sure you were not seriously hurt. Danny looked up and said, I am fine, just so. She sat down on the bench next to him, and her tail curled around the edge of the seat, and she said, you should not have been able to hit me. Danny shrugged and said, you were holding back. Not as much as you think, she admitted, and no student has ever landed a strike on me during the first month of training, and her tail moved closer to him, and you continue to surprise me. Danny felt his heart beat faster and said, is that a good thing? Lyra turned to look at him, and her silver eyes seemed to glow in the dim light, and she said, I do not know yet, and her tail reached out and wrapped gently around his hand. They sat like that for a moment, and Danny could feel the strength in her tail but also the gentleness. My people do not form bonds easily, she said quietly, and we are taught that most species are too fragile and that closeness leads to accidents. Danny squeezed her tail gently and said, I am not as fragile as I look. She laughed softly and said, I am beginning to believe that. Her tail unwrapped from his hand but trailed along his arm as it moved away, and she stood and said, rest well, Danny, and tomorrow we will train harder. It was the first time she had used his first name, and he smiled and said, good night, Lyra. Over the following weeks, Danny and Lyra fell into a pattern where they trained together every day, and slowly the professional distance between instructor and student began to blur. Lyra started staying after class to help Danny with techniques that the other students had already mastered, and her tail was constantly touching him in small ways that she claimed were corrections but felt like something more. Danny found himself looking forward to these private sessions more than anything else, and he loved the way Lyra's eyes lit up when he successfully completed a difficult move. One day, the Academy announced a combat tournament where students would fight in pairs, and Lyra asked Danny if he would be her demonstration partner for a presentation on cross-species fighting techniques. Danny agreed immediately, and they began practicing a choreographed fight sequence that would show how a human and a Draenei could work together. The sequence required trust because there were moments where Lyra would throw Danny and catch him with her tail, or where he would have to strike at her full speed, knowing she would block. During one practice session, Lyra threw Danny particularly high and he spun in the air and came down at an angle they had not practiced. Her tail shot out instinctively and wrapped around his entire torso and pulled him against her body, and they ended up face to face with his feet off the ground. "Sorry," she said, "but her tail did not loosen and I miscalculated the throw." Danny found himself staring into her silver eyes from inches away and said, "It is okay." They stayed like that for several heartbeats, and Danny could feel her breathing and smell something like rain and metal that must have been her natural scent. Lyra's tail slowly unwrapped and lowered him to the ground, but her hands came up and rested on his shoulders. "Danny," she said softly. "And this is complicated." He put his hands on her waist and said, "It does not have to be." She closed her eyes and her tail wrapped around both of them and pulled them closer, and she said, "My people mate for life, and when we bond it is forever, and I cannot offer you something." Casual Danny felt the weight of her words and said, "I would never want casual with you." Lyra opened her eyes and searched his face, and whatever she saw there made her decision because she leaned down and pressed her forehead against his. "This is forbidden," she whispered. "And instructors and students are not allowed to have relationships." "Then we will wait," Danny said, even though it hurt to say it. "And when I graduate, we will not be instructor and student anymore." Lyra pulled back and her tail unwrapped from around them, and she smiled sadly and said, 3 more months. 3 more months. Danny agreed, but her tail found his hand again and wrapped around it and squeezed gently, and they both knew that waiting was going to be the hardest training they had ever done. The next 3 months were the most challenging of Danny's life, but not because of the training. He had grown strong enough under triple gravity that he could move almost normally, and his combat skills had improved to the point where he could last several minutes sparring with Lyra before she inevitably won. But every day he had to maintain professional distance from the woman whose tail he desperately wanted wrapped around him, and every accidental touch during training felt like electricity. Lyra was clearly struggling too because her tail had always been expressive, but now it constantly reached toward him before she caught herself and pulled it back. The other instructors had started to notice. Danny was studying in the library when Commander Thresh approached him, and Thresh was a massive being from a species that looked like walking trees. "Cadet Brooks," the commander said in his slow, deep voice. "And I have been observing your training." Danny stood and said, "Yes, sir, and is there a problem?" Thresh tilted his head and said, "On the contrary, you have exceeded all expectations, and Instructor Silvermoon speaks highly of your progress." "Thank you, sir," Danny replied cautiously. "However," Thresh continued, "and I have also noticed that you and the instructor have developed a rapport that goes beyond normal student-teacher relationships." Danny felt his stomach tighten and said, "We have maintained all proper protocols." "Sir," Thresh made a sound like wind through branches and said, "I am not accusing you of anything, and in fact I am impressed by your restraint." And his ancient eyes studied Danny closely. "And Lyra has not formed a bond with anyone in all her years here. And I am glad she has finally found someone worthy." Danny did not know what to say to that. "The rules exist for good reasons," Thresh said. But they are not meant to prevent genuine connections, and when you graduate, you will no longer be her student. And then you must decide what comes next." "Yes, sir," Danny said quietly. Thresh nodded and walked away, and Danny sat back down feeling both nervous and hopeful. That night Danny could not sleep, and he went to the observation deck where he often went to think, and he was surprised to find Lyra already there, staring out at the stars. Her tail twitched when she heard him approach, and she said, "I thought I might find you here." They stood side by side looking out at the infinite darkness, and Danny said, "Commander Thresh spoke to me today." Lyra sighed and said, He spoke to me as well, and he is perceptive. What did he say to you? Danny asked. She turned to face him, and her tail moved restlessly behind her, and he said that I was being foolish to wait, and that life is too short to deny happiness. Danny felt his heart race and said, What do you think? Lyra stepped closer and said, I think that I have never felt this way about anyone, and I think that you have become the most important person in my life. And her tail reached out and wrapped around his hand. And I think that waiting for graduation is both the right thing and the hardest thing I have ever done. Danny squeezed her tail gently and said, 62 more days. She laughed and said, You have been counting. Every single one, Danny admitted. They stood, like that, holding hands through her tail until Lyra reluctantly pulled away and said we should go before someone sees us. Danny nodded and watched her walk away, and her tail gave one last wave before she disappeared around the corner. The tournament arrived 2 weeks before graduation, and Danny and Lyra performed their demonstration fight in front of the entire academy. They moved together like they had been partners for years, and every throw and strike and block was perfect. And when Lyra caught Danny with her tail and spun him through the air, the crowd gasped at the trust required for such a move. They finished the sequence with Danny and Lyra standing back to back as simulated enemies surrounded them, and then moving in perfect sync to defend each other. The audience erupted in applause, and even the strictest instructors were nodding in approval as they left the arena. Lyra's tail brushed against Danny's hand for just a moment, and she whispered 50 days. The final month of training was focused on a survival exercise where students were dropped on a hostile moon and had to work in teams to reach an extraction point. Danny was partnered with 3 other cadets, including the Zentari, who had mocked him on the first day, but who had since become a friend. The moon had gravity similar to standard and weather that shifted without warning, and predators that hunted anything that moved. Their team did well, and Danny used everything Lyra had taught him to keep his team alive. And when they reached the extraction point, they were the second team to arrive. Lyra was waiting at the landing zone, and when she saw Danny, her whole face lit up and her tail moved in patterns of joy and relief. Well done, Cadet Brooks, she said, formally, but her eyes said much more. The final week arrived, and Danny took his final exams in combat theory and practical skills and galactic law. He passed everything with high marks, and on the last day, all the graduating cadets gathered in the ceremony hall. Danny stood with his class in his formal uniform and listened as Commander Thresh gave a speech about duty and honor and service. Then they called names one by one, and each graduate walked across the stage to receive their certification. When they called Danny's name, he walked up, and Thresh handed him the certificate and said, You have proven that humans belong among the stars. Danny saluted, and as he turned to leave the stage, he saw Lyra standing at the side, and she was smiling with tears in her silver eyes. The ceremony ended, and graduates scattered to celebrate with friends and family, and Danny made his way through the crowd looking for Lyra. He found her in the garden area behind the main building, and she was standing alone, looking at the stars again. Lyra, he said softly. She turned, and her tail was already moving toward him, and she said, You are no longer my student, no. Danny agreed, and I am not. Then there is nothing stopping us. She said, Nothing. Danny confirmed. Lyra crossed the distance between them in 3 quick steps, and her arms wrapped around him and her tail coiled around his waist, and she kissed him like she had been waiting her entire life to do so. Danny kissed her back and pulled her closer and felt her tail tighten around him, and everything else faded away. When they finally broke apart, Lyra pressed her forehead to his and said, In my culture, this means we are bonded. Danny smiled and said, I know, and I read about Drainy customs. She pulled back and looked at him with wide eyes. And you know what this means in that? It is permanent. Yes, Danny said. And I want permanent with you, Lyra. Tail unwrapped from his waist and moved to his hand, and their fingers intertwined with her tail, wrapping around both. My family will want to meet you, she said, and they will test you to make sure you are strong enough. Danny laughed and said, I trained under triple gravity for 6 months, and I think I can handle meeting your family. She smiled and said, They will love You and I know this because I love you." Danny felt his heart swell and said, "I love you too." They stood together in the garden, and above them the stars shone bright, and Danny thought about how he had come to the academy to become a soldier, but instead, he had found something much more valuable. He had found home. 2 months after graduation, Danny and Lyra stood at the docking port of her homeworld. Draenor and Danny felt nervous for the first time since meeting her. The planet had twice standard gravity, which was less than the triple gravity he had trained under, but still challenging. And Lyra had warned him that her family would not make things easy. "They will respect strength," she explained as their ship descended, and they will test you in every way they can think of." Danny squeezed her hand and said, "I am ready." Lyra, tail wrapped around his waist. And she said, "I know you are, and that is why I am bringing you home." The ship landed in a city that looked like it was carved from silverstone, and beings that looked like Lyra moved through the streets with their tails swaying behind them. Lyra's parents met them at the landing platform, and her father, Kale, was even taller than Lyra, with scars across his arms that spoke of a warrior life, and her mother, Sarah, had kind eyes but a tail that moved with barely contained energy. "So this is the human," Kale said, and his voice was deep and skeptical. "Father, this is Danny Brooks," Lyra said, and her tail tightened protectively around Danny, "and he is my bonded mate." Sarah moved forward and circled Danny slowly, and her tail reached out and touched his shoulder, testing his muscle. "And you are smaller than I expected. I am stronger than I look," Danny replied calmly. "We shall see," Kale said, "and come and we will have dinner and discuss your intentions." Dinner was held in their family home, and the table was filled with Lyra's siblings and cousins, and they all stared at Danny with open curiosity. The food was heavy and rich, and Danny ate carefully, knowing that they were watching his every move. Lyra's brother Tor, who was built like a mountain, leaned forward and said, "I hear you trained under triple gravities." Danny replied, "And Lyra was an excellent instructor." Tor laughed and said, "She is too gentle, and let me show you how we really train on Draenor." The next morning, Tor took Danny to a training complex, where Draeni warriors practiced, and the gravity was set to standard for their world, which was double what Danny had lived with on Earth. They sparred in front of an audience of Lyra family members, and Tor did not hold back the way Lyra always had. He was faster and stronger, and his tail struck like a whip, and Danny found himself on the defensive immediately, but Danny had learned from the best, and he remembered everything Lyra had taught him, and he started to adapt to Tor's style. He landed a solid strike to Tor's ribs, and then swept his legs with a move that made Lyra proud when she taught it to him. Tor went down hard, and the watching Draeni gasped. Tor got up laughing and said, "You have spirit, human," and he extended his hand, "And I approve of you." Danny shook his hand and said, "Thank you." Over the next week, Danny was tested in every way possible, and he fixed broken equipment to show his problem solving, and he helped Sarah in the garden to show his patience. And he spent hours with Kale discussing military strategy and human history. Each night Lyra would find him exhausted but happy, and her tail would wrap around him, and she would say, "You are doing wonderfully." On the 7th day, Kale called Danny into his study, and the old warrior looked at him seriously. "My daughter has chosen you," he said, and as her father, I must know that you understand what this means." Danny met his eyes and said, "It means I will love her and protect her and stand beside her for the rest of my life." Kale nodded slowly and said, "Draeni bonds are sacred, and if you ever hurt her, my tail will be the last thing you see." "I would expect nothing less," Danny replied, "but you should know that Lyra is the strongest person I have ever met, and she does not need my protection, but she has it anyway." Kale smiled for the first time and said, "You understand her. And that is good," and he stood and extended his hand, and "Welcome to our family." Danny Brooks. That evening, the family held a bonding ceremony, and Danny and Lyra stood before everyone they loved and spoke vows that were ancient, and binding Lyra's tail wrapped around Danny's arm as she promised to be his strength and his home and his partner in all things. Danny held her tail gently, as he promised to stand beside her through every challenge and to love her with everything he had. When the ceremony ended, the family celebrated, and Danny found himself pulled into dances and conversations, and he realized that he had been accepted completely late that night. Danny and Lyra stood on the balcony of their new home looking at the stars. Lyra leaned against him, and her tail wrapped around his waist, and she said, "Are you happy?" Danny kissed the top of her head and said, "I have never been happier." She looked up at him and said, "I was so afraid when you first walked into my training hall." "Why?" Danny asked. "Because I knew," she said. "And I knew from the moment I saw you that you would change everything." Danny smiled and said, "You changed everything for me too." They stood together, and Danny thought about the journey that had brought them here, and about the human who had requested triple gravity, and the Drainy instructor who had wrapped her tail around him. The galaxy had seemed so big and frightening when he first left Earth, and now it felt like home, because home was not a place. Home was Lyra, and her silver eyes, and her expressive tail, and the way she looked at him like he was the strongest person in the universe. A message alert chimed, and Lyra checked her data pad and smiled. "Commander Thresh has offered us both positions as combat instructors at the Academy," she said. Danny felt excitement surge through him and said, "Together." Together, Lyra confirmed, and her tail squeezed him tight. They would return to the Academy where they met, and they would train the next generation of warriors. And they would do it, side by side. Danny looked at Lyra and said, "I think we should accept." She kissed him and said, "I already did." He laughed and pulled her closer, and her tail wrapped around both of them like it always did. And Danny knew that whatever challenges came next, they would face them together, because he had learned something important during his time at the Academy, and it was not just about fighting or surviving under crushing gravity. He had learned that strength came in many forms, and that love could grow in the most unexpected places, and that sometimes the bravest thing you could do was ask for triple gravity and see what happened. And what happened was that he found Lyra, and that made everything worth it. Years later, when new students would ask Instructor Brooks about the scar on his shoulder or why Instructor Silvermoon Tail always stayed close to him, they would smile and tell the story about a human who was supposed to be too fragile for advanced combat, and about a Drainy who had never expected to find love, and about how they proved that the strongest bonds are the ones that form under pressure. And every new class would watch as Lyra tail wrapped protectively around Danny during demonstrations, and they would understand that some stories were not about strength or combat or survival. They were about finding someone who saw you not as fragile, but as capable, and not as weak, but as worthy, and not as alone, but as home. And that was the real lesson that Danny and Lyra taught, that love, like gravity, could hold you down or lift you up. And the difference was finding someone who made you stronger just by being beside you. And in a galaxy full of different species and cultures and worlds, the truth remained the same. Home was not where you came from. Home was who you chose to be with. And Danny had chosen Lyra, and she had wrapped her tail around him, and they had built a life together that defied every expectation, and that was the greatest victory of all.